Welcome back to another episode of 5 a.m. Theology. So, we were in the book of Judges a couple weeks ago, and we saw how one judge, Japheth, made a rash vow that if God gave him victory against the Ammonites, he would sacrifice the first thing that came out of his door to greet him when he got home. If you know the story, sadly, it was his only child, his daughter, that came out. And although he was devastated, he did follow through with the vow and he did kill her. Well, this week in the book of First Samuel, we see another rash vow, this time made by King Saul. But this vow is a totally different one than the one Japheth made. They're both rash and shouldn't have been made, but they're different. First Samuel 14:24 says, "And the men of Israel had been hard pressed that day. So Saul laid an oath on the people, saying, 'Cursed be the man who eats food until it is evening, and I am avenged of my enemies.'" Well, we find out later that Jonathan, his son, who wasn't there when Saul made this oath, because he was off knocking off the Philistine army with the help of God, he ate some honey off the ground because he was starving. And through God not answering Saul and then drawing lots and another stuff, Saul finds out that Jonathan broke the oath that he made. But the people stop him from killing Jonathan. So, Chris, the question is, should Saul have killed Jonathan based on the oath that he made?
Like Jephthah did.
Yeah.
Well, Saul's vow was rash, but it has a lot of other issues. On the surface, it might seem like Saul is being spiritual, making a vow to the Lord. It may seem like he's saying, "Oh, let's set today aside as a special day of fasting to God. And if we do, maybe God will do something great for us. And I'm so committed to us fasting for the Lord, I'm going to enforce it on my whole army with a curse." But there is nothing spiritual about this vow. It says the men had been hard pressed all day. They were fighting a war against their enemy, against God's enemies. They should have been pumped and ready to go, but they were hard pressed. Perhaps their morale was low, or they were tired and hungry, or all three. And it does seem like they were tired and hungry. But Saul, instead of seeing to the welfare of his men, puts more on them. He piles it on, saying, "Cursed be the man who eats food until evening, and I'm avenged of my enemies." Saul put the army of Israel under this rash vow so that he could take vengeance on his enemies. This battle is about Saul and his victory. There's no we in this with Saul. It's all about him.
Yep. And since Saul thought this battle was all about him, he should have just fasted himself. But he doesn't because his focus isn't on God or anything spiritual. Again, it's on himself, like you said. So the men went hungry all day, knowing Saul put them under a curse that if they dared eat anything, they'd be killed. Now, unbeknownst to Saul, as we see earlier in chapter 14 of First Samuel, like we said, Jonathan was off fighting the Philistines. He made a bold move, completely trusting in God against the Philistines, who the Israelites were fighting. And as a result of Jonathan's faith and bravery, First Samuel 14:13-14 tells us about Jonathan's strike on the Philistine camp. It says, "They fell before Jonathan, and his armor bearer killed them after him. And that first strike, which Jonathan and his armor bearer made, killed about 20 men within, as it were half a furrow's length in an acre of land. And there was panic in the camp, in the field, and among the people. The garrison and even the raiders trembled. The earth quaked, and it became a very great panic." So while Saul is trying to sound all spiritual, but really only cares about himself and his personal victory, Jonathan quietly and boldly steps out in faith and does something to bring victory to the Israelites to the glory of God.
And Saul's selfishness and self absorption isn't his only problem. Notice how he words the oath he makes. He says, "Cursed is the man." Saul's absolutely no authority to curse anybody. Saul was king, but he was not Israel's spiritual leader. That was Samuel. And as such, Samuel was the only qualified one to put people under such a vow and to attach some kind of curse to it. And to top it all off, here's the men, they're fighting for Saul, and he tells them that they'll be under a curse if they don't do what he says. That sounds a bit heavy-handed, I would say.
Mhm.
And not just that, it's pretty cruel. Saul could have said, "Why don't we all fast today?" Or, "I'm fasting until we conquer our enemy. Any of you want to join me?" He doesn't lead by example in any way. He just puts them all under this oath and then tells them they're going to be cursed if they disobey it. There's nothing wrong with fasting at all, but this wasn't a fast for God. It was forced fasting for Saul.
Exactly. So after putting the men under the curse, Saul then marches them through a forest that's apparently loaded with honey. And you have to admire the men's restraint that despite being famished and seeing honey all over, they don't eat it. Now, Jonathan has rejoined them by this time. And remember, he didn't hear Saul's oath. So he grabs his staff and gets a big old wad of honey and eats it. And he immediately feels better because he was famished. And then one of the soldiers near Jonathan tells him about the oath that his father made.
Yeah, well, here's Jonathan's response. He criticizes his father's vow. He says in 1 Samuel 14:29 to 30, "My father has troubled the land. See how my eyes have become bright because I tasted a little of this honey? How much better if the people had eaten freely today of the spoil of their enemies that they found. For now, the defeat among the Philistines has not been great." Jonathan recognizes that the army would have been much more better off and much more effective if they weren't all weak from hunger. And here we learn that they had food that they could have eaten from the spoil they took from the Philistines. Besides putting his men and his son under this curse, Saul's vow is even more destructive. It leads the men into gross sin. 1 Samuel 14:31 tells us they struck down the Philistines that day from Michmash to Ahilan, and the people were very faint. The people pounced on the spoil and took the sheep and oxen and calves and slaughtered them on the ground, and the people ate them with the blood. And we did an episode about the blood a while back and what it means to eat blood. This was sinful,
This was really sinful.
really sinful.
And it was because of Saul's recklessness and selfishness and narcissism. It's not a sin to fast or not fast, but as a result of making his men fast at the wrong time for the wrong reasons and putting them under a curse, his men committed a serious sin by eating the lifeblood of the animals that they captured from the Philistines. Now, later, when Saul realizes God isn't with them fighting the Philistines, it comes out that Jonathan broke Saul's vow, even though he did it completely unintentionally. Saul, like Japheth, was willing to kill his own child. 1 Samuel 14:43 to 44 says, "Tell me what you have done," Saul demanded of Jonathan. "I tasted a little honey," Jonathan admitted. "It was only a little bit on the end of my stick. Does that deserve death?" "Yes, Jonathan," Saul said. "You must die. May God strike me and even kill me if you do not die for this." That's the NLT version.
But the men intervene. Verse 45 says, "Then the people said to Saul, 'Shall Jonathan die who has worked this great salvation for Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day.' So the people ransomed Jonathan so he did not die." Saul assumes God was not with the army in fighting the Philistines because Jonathan ate honey, but maybe that wasn't the reason at all, and maybe the Israelite men realized that. Matthew Henry said this about it: "If God turns away our prayer, we have reason to suspect it is for some sin harbored in our hearts, which we should find out, that we may put it away and put it to death. We should always first suspect and examine ourselves, but an unhumbled heart suspects every other person and looks everywhere but at home for the sinful cause of calamity." Jonathan was discovered to be an offender. Those most indulgent to their own sins are most severe upon others. Those who disregard God's authority are most impatient when their commands are slighted. Ugh, perfect quote.
Yeah. So, Chris, the answer is no. Saul should not have killed Jonathan. And thankfully, the men realized it and jumped in and saved Jonathan's life. Jonathan was doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. He trusted God, he was bold, he was brave, he was taking on God's enemies, and he was doing it for the glory of God. And on top of that, Jonathan had no idea about the oath, so he didn't intentionally break it. Saul, on the other hand, was a Pharisee. For his own selfish reasons, he laid more on his men than God did. He required more from his men than God required. And then he completely went over the top when his commands weren't adhered to.
And there is application here for us. We can easily be prone to this same behavior, making up guidelines and acceptable behavior for ourselves and others that God has never laid on us. We see this all the time with Christians, even pastors, setting specific rules for dress or speech or leisure activities in general, rules that God never imposes in His Word. We need to beware of commands that have no basis in God's Word, things that fall under Christian liberty, like fasting. With everything that we do and don't do, and everything we expect others to do and not do, we need to follow the parameters of Scripture and not add our own interpretations to it. We can't bind our own consciences or the consciences of others with things that God does not demand of us Himself.
Yeah, if we don't, we may end up like Saul, putting unfair demands on others for our own selfish reasons or to look godly when we're behaving the exact opposite of godly. We need to check ourselves so we don't become legalistic Pharisees or, like Matthew Henry said, become someone who is indulgent and ignorant of our own sin while being severe and intolerant of others. And if there's one big thing we should take away from this, I'm going to quote Matthew Henry again because he nailed it. He said, "Those who most disregard God's authority are most impatient when their own commands are slighted."
And that's a great place to end. Have a blessed morning, everybody.